Unity or Unreal?
Construct 3 or Unity?
From Unity to Godot?
Should you use GameMaker to
Unreal or Construct 3?
RPG Maker.
Switched away from Unreal to
Scratch.
Thanks, Unity.
I love Godot.
Not to use Godot.
Unity equals bad game.
Over to Unreal from Godot.
Unity
Versus Unreal.
GDEVELOP.
Pick an engine.
Godot game engine?
Construct.
RPG Maker. GDEVELOP.
Unity.
Unreal.
We're switching to...
There's more game engines than Unity? I'm kidding. Of course there are. There's a whole bunch of them. And as you can tell, people have strong opinions about which engine to use. So today I'm going to see what all the fuss is about for myself and make the same simple game in 8 of the most popular game engines. So let's get to it. We'll start with Unity just because it's the most popular engine and it's the one I'm most familiar with. And by that, I mean it's the only one I've ever used. These are some popular games made with Unity. And of course, we can't forget about the highest tier games made by yours truly. Anyway, today we're gonna make a simple catch game. So first we gotta make our gameplay area or level. Luckily, Unity has a pretty big asset store where you can find lots of 3D models for your projects. I found this nice low poly asset bundle for cheap that I've been using a lot lately. So I made a gameplay area out of that. Then I found this free character model to serve as our player. We'll just plop him right into the game. And this bag of grain will serve as the falling object that our player has to catch. Now with all of our game objects in the game, we want to give them some functionality. The way you do this in Unity is by writing C# code in something called a script. So I put a script in the player that makes the player move when you push the arrow keys. There's a script on the bag of grain that tells it to disappear when the player touches it, and there's a script inside the score up here that says, when the player touches the bag of grain, add 1 point to the score. So in this way, all of our game objects and scripts work together to make our tiny little game come to life. And that's all there is to it really. Now of course I glossed over a couple things, and there are way more complexities that come with making a bigger game, but luckily Unity is well suited to handle almost all of them. Overall, I'd say Unity is a great all-purpose engine. Next up is Unreal Engine. I have to admit I was a little intimidated to try Unreal because it has a reputation for having a steep learning curve. It's capable of creating truly impressive graphics in games like these. But can I harness even the tiniest bit of its power? Let's find out. Well, first thing I notice is that the program itself is huge. My computer and modem were struggling just to download and install it. Once I got it running, I decided to take a slightly different approach to building the game this time around. I want to get the basic mechanics in place before tackling the visuals. So first, we'll drop in a camera and start working on the player movement. This barrel is our player, by the way. Just like in Unity, you code scripts that you attach to your in-game objects. But you have to code the scripts in C++, which is a language I don't know. So I opted to use Unreal's visual scripting system called Blueprints instead. Blueprints are like pre-made blocks of code, and you attach those to your game objects. So first I made a blueprint for the player's movement. Then I used Unreal's built-in physics to add gravity to our ball to make it fall. Then I made 11 spawn points and positioned them in the sky so the ball spawner will know where to spawn balls. Then just like our last game, I added a blueprint that tells the ball to disappear and increase the score if it touches the player, or to disappear and set the score to 0 if it touches the floor. And now that the basic mechanics are in place, I want to lean into the strengths of the engine. Gunther, throw on the RTX. So I went to the Unreal Engine marketplace to get some fancy 3D models. And honestly, this place is awesome. Like I found this free factory asset pack and it looks amazing. Of course my computer couldn't run the scene at more than 10 frames per second, but if I stood still, I could take in all its glory. So I picked out my favorite models and threw them into the game. Then I spent just a bit of time working on the lighting and effects to finish off our little catch game. It did end up taking about an hour to build and export just this one scene, but I have to say it looks pretty impressive considering I don't really know what I'm doing. All in all, Unreal Engine is great. It's by no means a lightweight engine and it does have a steeper learning curve, but if you're after cutting edge graphics, robust features, and you're willing to put in some work, Unreal Engine is capable of pretty much anything. And now for Godot, the new kid on the block. Godot is a completely open source and free game engine capable of making 2D and 3D games. And unlike Unreal, it's very lightweight and easy to run. Because Godot is relatively newer, there haven't been a lot of commercial games made with it yet, but its library is growing and there are a ton of cool games in production. So far, Godot is mostly known for making 2D games, but I want to try out some of its 3D capabilities. So I'm gonna make a 2.5D game this time around. Like last time, I started by just trying to get the basic mechanics working, and it wasn't too hard to figure them out. Godot uses its own scripting language called GDScript, which is very similar to Python. And after watching just a couple short tutorials, I was able to get the catcher moving left and right. Then I found this nice asset in the Godot asset library called Level Block. It lets you quickly build levels by placing textures on the inside faces of cubes that you can quickly stack together. And now we have the floor and back wall. Then I needed to create some 3D models for the game. I used this cool open source
tool called Magica Voxel. It's an easy to learn program that lets you make voxel models, which are basically 3D models made up of a bunch of small cubes. And I thought this pixelated look would fit well with the game. The model I used for the player came with the program, but I did try my hand at making a gold coin to use as our falling object, and I modeled some columns for the background. Then conveniently, someone in the Godot community made a tool to import Magica Voxel files directly into Godot, so that saved me a bit of time. Then I scripted the coins to spawn and the score to update, and had another nice little version of the game running. Overall, I'd have to say my experience using Godot was awesome. It's easy to use coming from Unity, and there's a great community of people supporting it. If you want a game engine that's completely open source, easy to run, and quite versatile, Godot's the way to go. Now to try out GameMaker. I was looking forward to trying GameMaker because I've always heard a lot about it and it's made some incredible titles. Though there may be some exceptions, GameMaker is mostly a 2D game engine, and to me that's really exciting because I love the charm and look of 2D games. So I decided to start by making the art and environment first this time around. GameMaker has a fairly nice sized asset store where I found this cool jungle tile set. It was really fun to build the level, and it's satisfying to see it come together like a little puzzle. GameMaker has a useful layer system so you can place tiles in the foreground and background and anywhere in between. I also really like the layout of GameMaker's interface, like everything feels very accessible and you don't have to dig too deep to find things. Next, I found this animated pixel art Viking on the asset store to use as our player. It was really simple to set up his animations and get a movement script on him. Then I worked on getting these jewels to spawn and fall from the sky for the player to catch. GameMaker uses its own scripting language called GML code, which is kind of like JavaScript. For some reason, the gems kept spawning every frame, but it ended up being a pretty simple fix. Then I added the same logic as in the previous versions of the game for collecting the gems and updating the score. I did add one extra mechanic to this version of the game. 2 fish jump up from the water that you have to dodge, or your score will be reset back to 0. All said and done, I have to say that working in GameMaker was a very pleasant experience. Something about it is just really fun and easy to use. If you're looking for an extremely capable and polished 2D game engine, then GameMaker's the perfect tool. The next game engine is Construct 3. It's the first no-code engine I've tried. That's right, you don't have to know how to program to use it. I couldn't find a definitive list of commercial games made with Construct, but these are a few of them along with some other cool projects still in development. The editor itself looks and works a lot like any other game engine, except it's an online editor that runs in the browser. The way this engine works is you still have your game objects, such as this blue circle I'm using as the player, and this red rectangle I'm using as the ground. But instead of coding scripts, you add these things called behaviors to your game objects to give them functionality. So I'm adding a movement behavior to the blue circle, and a behavior called solid to the red rectangle so the player won't fall through it. Then just like that, the player can move and jump on the platform. Then I went on itch.io and found some free pixel art sprites to use instead of our basic shapes. With those, I quickly designed a tiny pirate themed level, and now our pirate player is able to run and jump around in the level. Then I added chests that will fall from the sky for our player to catch. That was easy to do as well. I just added a physics behavior to the sprite. Next, we need to handle the player catching the chests and updating the score. Instead of writing code for this, Construct uses events. All I had to do was add in a collision event and say I want the score to increase when the collision event between the player and chest happens, and an event to reset the score when a chest hits the ground. And by using behaviors and events in this way, I quickly finished our little catch game. Overall, I'd say my experience using Construct 3 was great. It's really cool to be able to quickly get a game up and running without worrying about how to code it. I can definitely see myself using it to make smaller projects and prototypes in the future. Now for another no-code 2D game engine called GDEVELOP. I actually couldn't find any well-known commercial games made with GDEVELOP because I think it's still an emerging engine, but their website has an impressive showcase of projects, and there's a growing community of developers excited about the engine. On to making our game. GDEVELOP has a built-in pixel editor called Pascal, but I decided to use some art from their free asset library. The process for making the game in GDEVELOP was very similar to Construct. I was able to quickly get our player moving on a platform by adding behaviors to them. Then I made crates fall from the sky by putting a physics behavior on them. In this version of the game, I added falling missiles that the player has to dodge. And just like with Construct, there's an event system to handle what happens when the player catches a falling crate or gets hit by a missile, and the other game mechanics. Then I filled out the level by adding a background with trees and clouds and a score up top. And just like that, we have another finished version of the game. All in all, I'd say GDEVELOP is an awesome engine for anyone wanting to try 2D game development for the first time. I can't wait to use it more in the future and see what kind of finished games come out of the community. The next game engine in our experiment is RPG Maker MZ. I was honestly excited to try it out because the old Super Nintendo JRPGs are my childhood. RPG Maker itself has been around forever, and I remember playing the first version of it back in the day thinking I was going to make the next big Final Fantasy. RPG Maker is another no-code engine, and what's cool about it is that it has everything you need to make a game built into it. When you start off a project, it already has a title screen made and your party of 4 characters set up. It actually took me a bit to figure out how to go into the project files and delete the other 3 players because I didn't need them. The movement of the player is already set up, so there's nothing to do there. Then I tried to make a treasure chest fall, or in this case slide down from the top of the screen. RPG Maker has its own event system, but it works a bit differently than Construct and GDEVELOP. I had to look up a bunch of stuff, but eventually I managed to get the chest moving across the screen and the player able to collect it. Then I used some built-in tile sets to make the level. This was probably my favorite part of making the game. Next, I used the event system to spawn more chests for the player to collect. There wasn't an easy way to set up the score at the top, so I made an event that triggers this pig to tell you your score when the round is over. Cool, and there we have our functional little game loop. Overall, my impression of RPG Maker is that it's a lot of fun to play around with and it has a ton of charm, but it was the most inflexible of all the game engines I tried. It seems best suited for making a traditional top-down RPG, a visual novel, or a story-rich game. But if you want to make something outside of that, you might consider looking at another engine. Last but not least is a game engine called Scratch, made by MIT as an educational tool but has become so much more. If you go to the website, there are tons of really cool small games and projects made with Scratch. Now let's get to making our game. Scratch is similar to the other engines in many ways. First we make our game objects. I used an image of the seafloor that comes with Scratch as our background. Then I browsed the Scratch library and found an image of a bowl of cheese puffs to use as our character and a fortune cookie as the object that will fall. Then the way you give your in-game objects behaviors is a little different than the other engines. What you do is drag these colored blocks of code from the left over here onto your game object. So for the bowl of cheese puffs, I use a block that says, if the player hits the left arrow key, move the bowl to the left. And another block that says, if they hit the right arrow key, move the block to the right. Then I put some blocks on the fortune cookie that make it fall from a random starting point at the top of the screen and reset when it hits the floor or when the player touches it. Then I made a score and put some code blocks in it to increase the score or reset it. And I wanted to use Scratch's built-in image editor, so I made this fancy octopus for the game. Then I made it drop bananas that the player has to dodge. And that's it. We have a working catch game in Scratch. I have to say that working in Scratch is really enjoyable because it's so simple but still very capable. I think for kids or anyone just wanting to make a game, Scratch is an excellent first engine to get you started. So there you have it. I made the same small game in 8 different engines. I hope this project inspired you, and if you enjoyed it, please subscribe so I can keep doing things like this. Now get out there and make some games.